Welcome to this session on Catholic teaching on Hinduism and Buddhism in Nostra Aetate, Phenomenology and its theological implications in the case of Hindu theism. Certainly a fascinating topic, grammatically quite interesting in that it has two sets of colons. It would be interesting to have that unveiled. Our speaker today is Martin Ganeri, who, have you seen from the program, has a host of titles and has worn a host of hats. He's here in the capacity of the academic, so I would introduce him as Dr. Martin Ganeri and call him to our podium.
Well, thank you for that. I'm actually not wearing any hats, as you have noticed, unlike the Archimandrite. Well, one thing I can say, there's going to be no repetition in this talk. There's going to be something very different, although it will relate to other things, hopefully challenge some things. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at the invitation of Father Cahill, to be here for a number of reasons, partly for the conference itself, obviously in the topic, but also Blackfriars Oxford is part of the University of Oxford, the Dominican institution, and most years we welcome some of the students from Villanova University as visiting students, and it's been a delight for me to have taught many of those students, so it's an extra bonus to come here and to see Villanova, which a university with which we have many fond associations. And it's also a delight as well to be reunited with many people who have studied or taught at Heathrock College in this area. And as you know, unfortunately, Heathrock College has closed. So it's they'd like to have once again the experience of some of the work that college did in the past. So we move on then today to look at another part of Nostra Aetate, which is to do with its teaching on the great religions of the East. And as I'll explain as we go on, I'm going to look particularly at the case of Hinduism. So a noteworthy and welcome feature of official Catholic teaching in and since the Second Vatican Council has been the way that phenomenology of religions is introduced as a basis for making theological statements. By phenomenology of religions, I mean here the concrete reality of what there is in the other different religions and the resultant descriptions which we make of them. Descriptions which are meant, of course, to be accurate. By theological statements, I mean the evaluations made of other religions in the light of Christian faith, judgments about the true and holy in other religions, judgments about the spiritual affinity between Christianity and other religions, judgments about whether and what kind of dialogue there can be. In modern official teaching, we see that phenomenology of religions matters, the concrete reality of the religions matters, and having accurate descriptions matters. Theological statements are meant to be true to the concrete reality of religions, adequate to what is there. And this is certainly a welcome development, because it is certainly the case that theology of religions is better or worse depending on how adequately it takes on board what is actually there. Nostra Aetate itself includes a considerable amount of phenomenological detail about the religions it deals with, which serve as a basis for its own theological statements. The declaration on the Church's relation to non-Christian religions is both a descriptive and an evaluative statement. So in this talk, I want to consider the relationship between phenomenology and theology when it comes to the great religions of the East. Nostra Aetate, for its part, mentions Hinduism and Buddhism by name, and does offer short descriptive statements about them. So it is, of course, important that we consider these religions, which have been and remain so important for so many millions of our fellow human beings in the world. Indeed, as we consider the relationship between phenomenology and theology of religions in regard to them, important challenges arise about how we think through the relationship between Christianity and other religions more generally. It would be impossible to deal with the religions of the East comprehensively in one talk, and even to attempt to do so would reduce this talk to something very superficial. And so I want instead to consider just Hinduism, and indeed consider one aspect of Hinduism, namely the Hindu encounter with God, or Hindu theism. Hinduism is the world's third largest religious grouping, with Hindus numbering about 1 billion people all told, and most Hindus are theists. Hindu theism is a central feature of the religious life of a very large percentage of the human population. Hindu theism represents then a very important aspect of the great religions of the East. Over the centuries, however, Hindu theism has usually been appraised in very negative terms by Christians. It has been described as being polytheistic and so diametrically opposite to Christian monotheism, and indeed to Jewish and Muslim monotheism. On this basis, the theological judgment has often been made that Christianity cannot see the true and holy in Hindu theism, and that there is a lack of any significant spiritual affinity between Christianity and Hinduism. Instead, it has been commonplace to suggest that there is instead a particular affinity between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which rests on the basis that they are monotheistic and they alone are monotheistic religions. This particular affinity is further strengthened by the fact that these three religions share in their different ways in the same historical traditions, not least traditions centered on Abraham. And we've heard a considerable amount about all that in the course of this conference. Now, in this talk, I want to challenge these kind of theological statements, and I want to do so by questioning the phenomenology on which they rest. Instead, I want to argue that Hinduism does contain monotheistic religions. These monotheistic religions are furthermore centered on the dynamic of a mutual love between God and humanity. This is something that Christians can recognize as having a fundamental affinity with Christian monotheism, since Christianity locates love at the heart of both the relationship between God and humanity and within the very being of God himself. And this shift in the phenomenological description of Hinduism is in fact something that is found in Nostra Aetate and in official church teaching in and since the Second Vatican Council. And I would argue a consequent shift in the theological appraisal of Hinduism from a Christian perspective is supported by what is found in these documents. None of this, as it follows, is meant to question the value of the positive bonds between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam for theology or for dialogue. Yet I'd like to challenge the way Hinduism, and by extension other religions of the East, are excluded by many paradigms of how the religions relate to each other. I would also hope to deepen the theological understanding of what kind of spiritual affinity there is between monotheistic religions. Furthermore, I'd like to confirm thereby the wider importance of good phenomenology for the ongoing process of getting our theology of religions right in general. Before we go any further, it is important to get clear about what we mean when we talk about Hinduism. Very often, confusion about Hindus and their beliefs and practices arise because it's assumed that Hinduism is one religion, a single system. However, as the German Indologist Heinrich von Stetenkron has put it, in his own words, Hinduism, he says, should be understood to denote a socio-cultural unit or civilization which contains a plurality of distinct religions. The term Hinduism is really just a kind of shorthand or blanket term for everything that is contained in this civilization. In reality, we have many different religions, even if they share many features and interact with each other. Some of these are non-theistic in nature, many of them are theistic traditions. And within this rich civilization, we have to consider each theistic tradition and consider whether that particular tradition is monotheistic or not, and if so, what kind of monotheism it does represent. So let me start by looking at what Nostra Aetate itself says about Hinduism and consider how it came to be there and how it relates to other official teaching of that time. Nostra Aetate states that its aim is to consider what human beings have in common and what tends to promote fellowship among them. It then sets out a set of common questions to which the different religions are said to give answers. Questions about the nature of human beings and the meaning and goal of human life, questions about the nature of the divine, the ultimate inexpressible mystery, as the document puts it, beyond human explanation, which embraces our entire existence, from which we take our origin and towards which we tend. The document then moves on to state, and again a quote from the document, the religions which are found in more advanced civilizations endeavor by way of well-defined concepts and exact language to answer these questions. Thus, in Hinduism, men explore the divine mystery and express it both in the limitless riches of myth and the accurately defined insights of philosophy. They seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God in confidence and love. That Hinduism is mentioned at all in this document is itself an unexpected gift in a document which as a whole was an unexpected gift. When the decision during the council had been made to expand the scope of the document in this way, the commission responsible for the document drew in the expertise of other scholars and theologians who had the requisite knowledge of the different traditions, including the Jesuit theologian Joseph Neuner, who was otherwise playing an important role in the council as a whole. It was almost certainly Neuner who was responsible for the section on Hinduism. In fact, it was, as I had confirmed a moment ago. Neuner had spent many decades in India and was a member of a body of 20th century Catholic Indologists, that's to say scholars of the Indian traditions, who came to be known collectively as the Calcutta School from the fact that they were predominantly Jesuits belonging to the Belgian Vicariate and centred in Calcutta. These Catholic Indologists undertook serious study of the classical and modern traditions of Hindu religion and sought to base their own theological assessment on Hinduism on such exacting phenomenological study. The short passage on Hinduism in Nostra Aetate is not intended to be an exhaustive account of Hinduism, but rather to point to some aspects of the way Hindus over the centuries have answered the common questions posed by all human beings as part of what people have in common and what draws them into fellowship, as the opening paragraph of Nostra Aetate puts it. At the same time, however, the short passage on Hinduism is certainly a masterpiece in that it does manage, in so few words, to allude to so many of the most important features of Hinduism as a whole. In the passage in Nostra Aetate, Hindus are said to seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God in confidence and love. Recourse to God in confidence and love, which in the Latin original is per refugium ad Deum cum amore et confidentia, and might more closely be translated as through refuge in God, it will love and trust, or in love and trust. And as we'll see, these few words are very carefully chosen and allude very precisely to central concepts and attitudes within Hindu theistic traditions. By extension, indeed, all the features of the statement on Hinduism as a whole echo important features of Hindu theism. The search for freedom from the anguish of the human condition, the use of ascetical practices and meditation, the contemplation of the divine mystery through the riches of mythology and philosophical inquiry. These wider statements could apply also to non-theistic traditions in Hinduism, but they certainly do allude to what characterizes the theistic traditions. And so this passage then is an example of phenomenology, and good phenomenology at that. So even if, however, the inclusion of Hinduism was a new feature in the declaration itself, the scene had been set only a few months before by statements made by Pope Paul VI, both in his encyclical Ecclesiam Suam, and very shortly afterwards in the context of his visit to India for the Eucharistic Congress held in Bombay in 1964. In Ecclesiam Suam, the Pope speaks of the Church's relations with and dialogue with the world in terms of a number of concentric circles, each of which specifies a group closer and closer to the Catholic Church. The first is that of humanity taken as a whole. The second, and the closer one, is that of those who, in the words of the document, are said to who above all adore the one supreme God whom we too adore. A circle which includes the Jews, the Muslims, and also, as it says, the followers of the great Afro-Asiatic religions. And here we have an intriguing mention of monotheism as a mark of other religions and as something which creates a closer bond with Christianity. As the Pope teaches in the document, and again I quote from it, we refer to the children worthy of our affection and respect of the Hebrew people faithful to the religion which we call the Old Testament, then to the adorers of God according to the concept of monotheism, the Muslim religion especially, deserving of our admiration for all that is true and good in their worship of God, and also to the followers of the great Afro-Asiatic religions. And this statement is intriguing because it's not clear if in the text the term monotheism is meant to describe Muslim belief in God only, or also to recognize that monotheism may be present elsewhere. At the very least, the presence of theistic traditions within Hinduism is alluded to, and this is stated to be the phenomenological basis for the theological statements that this creates a certain closeness with the Church, which overlaps with that of Jews and Muslims. In his address to representatives of the various religions of India in Bombay, Pope Paul more explicitly refers to the search for God in Indian traditions, and here he draws upon a passage from one of the Upanishads, a body of ancient sacred texts of immense importance for very many Hindus. Again, to quote the Pope's own words in this address, as he says, "This visit to India is the fulfillment of a long-cherished desire. Yours is a land of ancient culture, the cradle of great religions, the home of a nation that has sought God with relentless desire in deep meditation and silence, and in hymns of fervent prayer. Rarely has this longing for God been expressed with words so full of the spirit of Advent as in the words written in your sacred books so many centuries before Christ. And he quotes here from one of the Upanishads, "From the unreal, lead me to the real. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality." The final quotation in this text is from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, one of the oldest and longest of the Upanishads. As with any sacred text of any religion, this text has to be understood within the wider text, but also within the wider tradition in which it is located. And certainly taken as a whole, the Upanishads represent one of the most important witnesses to monotheism for those who belong to Hindu theistic traditions. So in Nostra Aetate and in these other documents, we see the presence of phenomenology of religions serving as a basis for theological statements about the fellowship that exists between members of different religions, about the true and holy present in other religions, and about the spiritual affinity between Christianity and these other religions. We see a phenomenology of Hinduism which identifies the presence of theistic traditions within Hinduism as providing such a basis. At the same time, the crucial question of whether Hindu theism is acknowledged by the Church as monotheistic is left in the air and in need of further clarification, though it is at least implicit in what is said. So let me now turn to Hindu theism in more detail and to the manifestation of monotheism within it before we reflect on what challenges and further theological consequences we might draw from a Christian recognition of this fact. As I've said, Hindu theism is not one religion, but a civilization which contains many different religions. And this is true of Hindu theism as anything else. There are certainly many different Hindu theistic religions. The many different theistic cults have nonetheless also often been grouped together by Hindus as belonging to one of three greater traditions. Vaishnavism, centered on the worship of the male deity Vishnu; Shaivism, centered on the male deity Shiva; and Shakta religion, centered on the worship of Shakti, the divine in female form. Some of these theistic cults were and have been very localized and centered on simple ritual practice, but also very sophisticated traditions of theological reflection have also developed, using the riches of myth and searching philosophical inquiry to articulate what the sacred texts are understood to teach, what is really to be believed about the nature of God, and what account is to be given of the presence of other theistic traditions within Hinduism, and indeed elsewhere. As with describing Hinduism as a whole, so with Hindu theism, the more general account we give, the less useful it becomes as a true insight into what Hindu theists believe and how they understand their own tradition. Much better is to look at a particular tradition and at how individual Hindus view it. And here we are fortunate to have many scholarly accounts written by modern Hindu scholars belonging to different traditions who are themselves aware of Western and Christian attitudes towards Hinduism and indeed respond then to these attitudes. And in what follows, I want to outline what one such scholar, Srinivasachari, says about his own tradition, the Vaishnava tradition, and in particular about a form of Vaishnavism, otherwise known as Sri Vaishnavism, which developed in the south of India, which then influenced other forms of Vaishnavism over the centuries. The Sri Vaishnava tradition is what's called a Vedantic tradition. That's to say, it is one which regards as foundational sacred texts, but both the Upanishads, the sacred texts which Pope Paul VI mentions, and also the Bhagavad Gita, that well-known Hindu theistic text in which Vishnu as Krishna teaches his companion Arjuna about the nature of God and the path to reach him. Sri Vaishnavism is also a tradition in which over the centuries great teachers have produced philosophical works parallel in approach and in sophistication to scholastic theology in the West. Within Sri Vaishnavism, the greatest teacher of all is a figure called Ramanuja, whose traditional dates are between 1017 and 1137. And so by considering Charya's account of it, we can get a clear insight into how these sacred texts are understood and what sophisticated philosophical account of God has developed within the Vaishnava tradition of Hindu theism. For his part, Srinivasa Chari is both a traditional and a modern scholar. He knows the sacred texts and the philosophical works of Sri Vaishnavism in great depth and draws on them for his account of Vaishnava theism, but he also knows Western and Christian accounts of Hinduism, and so is able to give an informed and robust response to Western and other non-Hindu perspectives on Hindu theism. Thus, in response to the common Western depiction of Hinduism as polytheistic, Chari argues that the truth is rather that Hinduism does contain a number of theistic traditions, each of which gives exclusive worship to one deity as the supreme reality. These traditions are, then he argues, monotheistic religions. A Vaishnava is able to acknowledge that other Hindu traditions like Shaivism are also monotheistic in character and have much value in them, but a Vaishnava still regards Vaishnavism as containing a truer account of God than these other religions. And Vaishnavism understands the mention of other gods in the sacred texts as being what Chari calls functional appellations of Vishnu, as to say, regarding them as either finite beings created by Vishnu and endowed with power to carry out creative functions for Vishnu, or merely names of Vishnu carrying out particular functions. Looking at how Vaishnavism has read the sacred texts of the Upanishads, Chari outlines the fundamental Vaishnava concept of God, which the tradition finds within them. God is the one and omnipotent creator, sustainer, and destroyer of all the world. As an important passage from another Upanishad, the Taittiriya Upanishad puts it, God is, and to quote from that document, that from which all these beings are born, and that by which when born they live, and unto which when departing they enter. This God is immanent in the world, which is his body, as its inner controller, ruling and guiding it at all times, and yet God remains transcendent. And again, as the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad elsewhere states, and to give the words again, he who dwells in the earth, yet is within the earth, whom the earth does not know, whose body the earth is, who controls the earth from within, he is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. In the Upanishads, God's essential nature is described as being consciousness, infinite, and as bliss. God as being is infinite and immutable existence, and as consciousness is existence which is also unlimited and immutable intelligence. God's existence as unlimited consciousness is also fully one of bliss, and one that is free from any kind of imperfection. Looking also at how his Vaishnava tradition has read the other sacred text of the Bhagavad Gita, Chari goes on to outline the relationship between God and humanity. God makes himself accessible to human beings in order to be known and obtained by them. God is characterized as being full of compassion and tender love towards human beings, concerned to rescue them from the bondage of ignorance and the confines of human life as it is experienced. And the human response to this is that of bhakti, a term which has come to describe Hindu theism more generally. Hindu theism is thus often called bhakti religion. Bhakti means generally a relationship of devotion to God or communion with God, and within the Vaishnava tradition of Chari, it is further characterized as a form of loving knowledge. That's to say, it is both an intense love for God, which arises when a human being realizes that obtaining God is the ultimate goal of human life, and it is the increasingly vivid and full knowledge of God, a knowledge which a human being cultivates through meditation on the teaching of the sacred texts and through worship of God. As this knowledge deepens, so the intensity of that love also itself increases. The devotee or bhakta of God is also reliant on God's grace to come to the fullness of that knowledge, which God willingly gives in response to human love for God. The Bhagavad Gita is taken to teach that the relationship between God and human beings is moreover one of mutual love. In a passage at the end of the Gita, and of immense importance to Vaishnava theology and religious practice, Krishna teaches the doctrine of this mutual love to the hero Arjuna, who is the archetypal devotee of God. And to quote from that text again, "With strong desire, I, Krishna, have desired thee, Arjuna. Therefore shall I tell thee thy salvation. Think of me, worship me, sacrifice to me, pay me homage. So shalt thou come to me. I promise thee truly, for I love thee well. Give up all things of the law, turn to me only as thy refuge. I will deliver thee from all evil, have no care." So in this passage then, we have, as you'll have noticed, mention of God making God our refuge. And this is understood to refer to another key term for the right response of human beings to God, namely the term property or self-surrender. For Sri Vaishnavism, the sure path to God is to surrender oneself to God, recognizing that we are unable to help ourselves in getting release from our bondage and obtaining God, but must instead rely on God's grace, who loves us and hence wishes to give us salvation. Such self-surrender to God, as humanity's one refuge, is characterized by an intense love for God and by complete trust in God. And we can now see what it is that Nostra Aetate is talking about when it says that they seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God in confidence and love. The last words of this passage allude precisely to the idea of bhakti, and more specifically of property or self-surrender, which, as we have seen, came to be the central dynamic in the Sri Vaishnava understanding of how human beings should respond to God. So very briefly then, this is how one modern Hindu scholar describes his own Vaishnava tradition. And I've had to go, because it's not as familiar to people, the whole Hindu set of traditions as others, and I've kind of gone into more detail about it. Obviously, it's kind of a lot of detail to take on board if you're unfamiliar with it, but trust me that this is the correct picture of that tradition. For Churi, the scholar we've been talking about, Hindu theism is monotheistic, and it is a monotheism which is one of mutual love of God and human beings. We could choose other Vaishnava traditions, or we could choose other Hindu theistic religions, and were we to do so, we would certainly see variants and differences. But the account that Churi gives, and the tradition he belongs to, is still representative of a wider presence of monotheistic belief within Hinduism as a whole, and a wider presence of monotheism which is characterized by love. So it's not just Churi's tradition which has this understanding of God in the Hindu collection of traditions. So let's now return to the question of what theological consequences arise from phenomenological study of Hinduism. Here I would like first of all to look at some of the theological statements of modern Catholic scholars of Hinduism and to consider how they have reacted to their own study of Hindu religious traditions and how they have come to recognize the common ground which Hindu tradition has with Christianity. Already we have mentioned Joseph Neuner. In an article on the Bhagavad Gita and its relationship to Christianity, Neuner himself comments, again these are his words, we should, when reading the lofty passages of the Gita, feel an intimate closeness to all those who love God. Those who are able to pray in the words of the Gita are certainly touched by the grace of God and are set out in deep earnestness and resolve on the path of the greatest deed man can do, his surrender to God. End of the quote. We've noted that Neuner was a member of what is known as the Calcutta School of Catholic Indologists, Western missionary scholars working in India in the middle of the 20th century. The other members of this school likewise engaged in the study of Hindu theism and in reflection of a Catholic appraisal of it. Thus, in a study of Hindu bhakti religion in general, that is, of the devotional traditions of which the Vaishnavism of Srinivasacharya is one example, another Jesuit, the Belgian Jesuit Pierre Fallon, comments, as he puts it, Hindu bhakti must have led many souls to God because of the humble and loving surrender, the deep yearning and prayer, the confident reliance upon God's grace of the true bhaktas, true devotees. Another Jesuit, the Indian Catholic Indologist theologian Mariasuse Dewamani, characterizes the different Hindu bhakti traditions centered on the mutual love of God and humanity as being Hinduism's, as he puts it, religion of love. For his part, Dewamani is representative of those Indian Catholic scholars whose own personal as well as academic familiarity with Hindu theism has led them to recognize that there is a close spiritual affinity between this kind of Hindu theism and Christian theism. Thus, Dewamani states, in his own words again, bhakti, which means love and surrender to God, involves the idea of God as a supreme person. Of all Hindu experiences, bhakti experience comes nearest to Christian experience, for in this experience we come across the necessity of repentance and of a purified heart before God's grace can become effective, the need for realizing fellowship with God in union with him, and the profound sense of dependence on him alone and of loyal service and surrender to him. Dewamani suggests that such bhakti experience is indeed one of a real communion with the living God of love, an experience which is marked by the presence of divine grace. It is this experience that can, for Dewamani, be said to be a real meeting point between Christianity and Hinduism. Such Western and Indian theologians do not simply want to assert that Christian and Hindu theisms are the same. In the work of Noyna, Fallon, and Dewamuni, there's a clear sense of the difference between these traditions. Dewamuni, for his part, balances his affirmation of affinity and a meeting point between the two religions with a clear sense that as historical religions, with their developed beliefs and practices over the course of history, they are indeed very different. Neither is he advancing an account of religions which just sees them as different and equal manifestations of a common experience, as many pluralist accounts of religions might. Dewamuni remains committed to the particular claims of Christianity, but he also recognizes a certain and very significant common ground between the two religious traditions. The work of these theologians, then, represents a wider context in which we can locate the teaching found in Nostra Aetate and other official church teaching of the period. Subsequent official teaching, for its part, has tended to continue the type of comments and approach found in these earlier documents. Thus, for example, in Pope John Paul II's first visit to South India in 1986, he drew attention to one of the Tamil saints, Patinathar, as a representative of the many South Indian poets who promoted the devotional or bhakti theism we've been considering. And as he puts it in his address, because we believe in man, in his value and in his innate excellence, we love him and serve him and seek to relieve his sufferings. As the sage of Tamil Nadu, Patinathar, puts it, believe in the one above, believe that God is, know that all other wealth is naught, feed the hungry, know that righteousness and good company are beneficial, be content that God's will be done. A sermon this unto you, O heart. So in this passage then, we also have a further aspect of Hindu bhakti religion being pointed to, namely the fact that love of God is aligned with love for other human beings and to a positive social ethic. So then if we follow the kind of account given by Chari, and if phenomenology of religion causes us to recognize indeed the presence of true monotheism in Hinduism, and also the particular presence of a monotheism of love, this does have consequences both for an adequate Christian theology of Hinduism and indeed for theological paradigms of how Christianity relates to different religions in general, whether these paradigms are found in official teaching or in the work of Catholic theologians or in the language of interreligious dialogue. And so I'd like to finish by returning to two challenges which Hindu monotheism poses as kind of the wider reflection on the relationship between Christianity and other religions. The first challenge is the fact itself of Hindu monotheism. The recognition that there are monotheistic traditions within Hinduism should at least challenge the many cases where only Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are said to be the three monotheistic religions. To say that this is wrong and stands in need of correction is in itself simply a matter of correct phenomenology. At the same time, it also has very significant theological consequences. Monotheism is one way in which the religions answer the fundamental questions that Nostra Aetate presents at the beginning of the document, and the presence of monotheism creates the theological common ground, a meeting point of fellowship. Monotheism is important because it is the right answer to the question of, and again the words of Nostra Aetate, of the ultimate inexpressible mystery beyond human explanation, which embraces our entire existence, from which we take our origin and towards which we tend. To be monotheistic is to understand God as God is, and to be right according both to revelation and reason. And this creates a theological closeness between those religions recognized as monotheistic. So the presence of monotheism in Hinduism is the presence of the true in Hinduism, and it draws Christians, Jews, Muslims, and also Hindus into the same fellowship of a common and true recognition of God as one only, as the source of all that there is, as the goal of all that there is. Thus, the recognition of monotheism in Hinduism challenges us to recognize the problems present in the common language that is found of the three, when people talk about the three monotheistic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it challenges us to expand this paradigm, which is both phenomenal and theological, to include at least some of the religions of the East. The second challenge has to do with the recognition that Hinduism contains not just monotheistic religions, but also that the characteristic of such monotheism is a religion of love. Hindu monotheism is itself a religion of love. Christianity emphasizes love as being the fundamental relationship between God and humanity, and as the fundamental response which human beings should show to God and to other human beings. Central to the Christian understanding of God is talk of the Holy Spirit as the love of God, hence of love being at the very heart of God's being, something also present as grace in human beings, transforming them into sharing in God's own love of himself. So there is a particular form of fellowship which arises when the common ground between religions is not just monotheism, but a common monotheism of love. This should perhaps also make us wary about too simplistically turning another area of common ground between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam into something which excludes Hinduism. And I mean here the assertion of a fellowship which arises from common possession of elements of the historical revelation contained in the Bible. This certainly does create a particular fellowship between the three religions, and yet alongside this, and in some tension with this, is that fellowship which is present when there is a common concept and experience of God, however that has been derived. So, in conclusion, theological accounts of the religions of the East remain in need of much further exploration if they are to be adequate to the richness as well as the diversity of what these religions are. I hope that at least I've been able to indicate in this talk how important the phenomenology of these religions is for such theology. It has certainly been a very valuable achievement of the years around and since Nostra Aetate, that the study of religions as they are has been located firmly as the basis for good theology. Yet there remain considerable challenges ahead, not least when we recognize that the concrete reality of the religions will always push us towards increasing complexity and nuance in our understanding of how Christianity relates to other religions, and indeed they to it. Thank you very much. Well, I'll say it then. Now we have a few moments for questions.
Could you give a brief definition of phenomenology as you were talking about it?
Yeah, well, as I said at the beginning, by phenomenology of religions, I mean here the concrete reality of what there is in the different religions and the resultant descriptions we have of them. So it's just it's a way in which, I suppose it's kind of, it's a use of this term which is found in theological syllabuses. For instance, a pontifical syllabus. You have a course on phenomenology of religions, which will mean this, the actual description of the religions, as opposed to theology of religions, which will be a Christian evaluation of those religions.
Martin, thank you very much for a very thoughtful paper. It really broadened the horizons of all of us here, but also the whole conference itself and the understanding of Nostra Aetate. And there's many challenging points there, but I wanted to ask is that there's often a reflection or a task that if the Church was going to construct Nostra Aetate again in a different way, could you say how you feel that between the 1960s and today, what sort of description could Catholic theological thought give to modern or give to Hinduism?
Okay. Well, I think it would be along the. I think if Nostra Aetate was going to be rewritten, then obviously, in a way, the way it developed was a kind of an organic approach. So, kind of with all the difficulties which we're aware of and other aspects of its presentation. So, what you want today would be a kind of more systematic thing, and I think it would be one which did. Draw out theological statements about Hinduism, one which were based on just a much stronger knowledge of those traditions. Along the lines of which I've talked about, the kind of the recognition of there is no one system, but a diversity of religious traditions, and how you actually look at these traditions, how you look at you don't just appraise them on the basis of just a popular approach or a superficial approach, but you actually look at them at a level of parity. So if we talk about Christianity by reference to the sophisticated theological traditions in Christianity, we must talk about Hinduism by reference as well to the theological traditions that are found within that, rather than just a kind of a superficial look at kind of a popular way it presents itself. So I would say, in answer to the question, well, I would, it'd be a kind of a recognition of things like monotheism, the kind of and a recognition of sophisticated accounts within it. And but on the other hand, that. What is remarkable about Nostra Aetate is the fact that it does, considering how it developed and everything, bit by bit, how good a job it did, those short descriptions. If we're to think, well, nowadays, what would you want to do? Well, I think one thing, a problematic, which I haven't really talked about in this talk. But again, is something which we need to reflect in account. Is the problem of phenomenology itself in terms of, in the definition I've given here, that kind of an obvious tendency or kind of an emphasis within Nostra Aetate is very much looking at points of common ground. Well, of course, you have to locate any point that's mentioned within the wider context of its tradition, and then consider, well, just how common is that actual ground there, and then you begin to reflect on theological consequences of that. I suppose just building up on what I've talked about, I think a lot of the the supposed common points between Christianity and Islam, for instance, actually were, are really much more problematic, and actually also include a great degree of alienation, which puts question on, just how much common ground you actually have just by the simple fact that there is an overlap of historical elements. So again, that nuance, I think, should be there. But I mean, one could expect all these things of another version of Nostra Aetate, and that would reflect all the complexity and the difficulties we've had since then. But I mean, I think Nostra Aetate did a very good job in what it was doing. But I mean, certainly, if you're having a document now, then you'd want to have I think you'd want a much better articulation of, a better theology, which is based on a more scientific and well-informed understanding of these religions.
Well, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Just the last 2 minutes. As an anthropologist of religion and ethnographer and a phenomenologist, I'd like to thank you for the shout out in a way. But there's also another thing going on, and people like Frank Clooney and James Fredericks have talked about a sort of temporary moratorium on theologies of religion until we do more active work of, obviously, comparative theology. Maybe you could explain comparative theology to our participants as a way forward that built up on Nostra Aetate in the subsequent decades.
Well, just to do what you've asked me to do, then comparative theology is a kind of fairly recent discipline within theology. One of its greatest exponents has again been the Jesuit Francis Clooney, who's in your Cambridge, your Harvard, it's not a very, in many ways, it's not a very helpful term. Comparative theology, it has lots of possible ways of reading it, which are wrong. But basically, it describes a modern discipline of theology where theological encounter with other religious traditions matters for the way one does theology. So part of the inspiration for one's theology comes from the encounter with another religious tradition. And this is, it's part, as it were, is one option within the way we do theology. Again, people tend to get very unhappy because they with this discipline, because they feel that this is then being presented as the only way theology should be done. But of course we know, and any of us who are doing theology, that there are many different ways in which we can do theology, and we can draw upon many different things as the kind of resources for, to a large extent, the kind of imaginative aspects of the work of theology as we try and express the mysteries which theology talks about. And so comparative theology is a discipline where the emphasis is put on explicit encounter with the thought or the theology of other traditions, whether it be Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Judaism or other traditions. And there are two ways, broadly speaking, we'll talk about two forms of comparative theology. One is represented by a comparative theologian like Keith Ward, who was Regius Professor in Oxford, where in his various works, he's looking at particular issues within theology, like revelation or the doctrine of God and creation, and it would draw upon other traditions as kind of common as resources, and then reflect out of that wider encounter what we can say, and indeed what a Christian theologian can say as the person doing this exercise, although it could be done by other people, about the theological topic. Whereas Frank Clooney a slightly different approach. He's actually involved in, as it were, a deep reading of a limited number of texts, and it goes out of a kind of what he calls a collectio, a reading together in the manner of lectio divina, the kind of meditative reading of sacred texts. Then out of this kind of close reading of just a limited number of texts, he kind of comes to have an insight into the meaning of the Christian text he's studying, or kind of an insight into how we approach an aspect of the encounter with God, or an aspect of theology. So that's just very briefly what is meant by comparative theology, and I suppose in some ways that is more my own particular interest, this kind of theology, and then yes, I mean, in the case of Hinduism, well, yes, I mean, kind of the encounter with Hindu religious texts, monotheistic texts about the loving encounter between God and humanity, then provides a resource, a source of inspiration for doing, in my case, a Christian theology. Enough? Yeah. Okay. So again, just to go, I mean, we are 7 minutes past 5. So I mean, unless it's a very quick question or comment, was it? But we must finish really.
Very briefly,
Yeah.
I just wanted to push Anthony's question. You presented us with a very good challenge, Martin. We just wanted to push that, specify it in the direction of a hermeneutic of suspicion. And I want to make that self-critical from a Catholic perspective as well. But in light of what's happened since the Council, as with the violence in the Islamic world, we've also witnessed violence in the Indian subcontinent between Hindus and Muslims, and the emergence of Hindu nationalism. And so I wanted just to sort of touch on the dark side of Hinduism, as it were.
Yeah.
And whether you could talk a little bit about, briefly, from sort of, as I say, hermeneutic of suspicion, it's not all, social ethics, it's not all love that we're learning about on the Indian subcontinent. So that's really my
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, from that, it's a good point to make. I mean, and it's very important for all this kind of stuff. The whole relationship has become very complex and difficult with the rise of Hindu nationalism. Has had an immensely corrosive effect on Hindu-Christian relations, on the nature of theological and spiritual encounter, because not only has there been active persecution and killing of Christians by Hindus, but also very, very vehement opposition to Catholicism. I mean, some of these Hindu right-wing groups were created, like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, to oppose the papal visit to India, the first one that we've talked about at various times. But also then, the way often it's taught that any theological encounter, spiritual encounter with Hinduism by Christians, kind of enculturation, is seen as a threat rather than a kind of a good thing. And so that means that Christians are more reluctant to do it themselves. They feel alienated by the Hindus in India. So yeah, I mean, that reality of that much more problematic relationship is certainly there now, and it tends to mean that the Christian churches in India they still carry on themselves a kind of encounter with Hinduism, and I don't think it would mean that they would reject the kind of things that I'm saying. I mean, they wouldn't be saying, well, now because Hindus have become violent, we reject the idea of Hindu monotheism. No, I mean that's would be an odd thing to do. But in terms of what they feel comfortable about doing in terms of encounter, certainly that's become much more problematic. And so the churches just get on with what they're doing. The actual encounter with Hindus is often one of just managing the fact of opposition, managing the fact of violence, and insisting on, I mean, again, and this does touch then on other things we talked about in the course of the conference, on secularism. India itself has a very good secular state, well, had a very good secular constitution, which has been threatened by Hindu nationalism. But that's a form of secularism which allows the religions to flourish, where there's a very good sense of everyone is a citizen, everyone is equal, it's an enormously positive thing in the evolution of Indian nationalism. So that becomes a resource then for Christians now in India to appeal to the modern secular constitution against Hindu nationalism. But I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, kind of obviously the reality of all this stuff does impact on Hindu-Christian relations, kind of there. And I mean, and again, one could rewrite Nostra Aetate as a reflection of all the socio-political realities since then, with everything that's been said, including the kind of the problems between Hindus and Christians.